If you've been doing this long enough, if you've been aware of what's happening in the world, you will invariably have come up to the notion of the deep state. It's heard all the time. The deep state, I prefer shadow government, but the deep state is what you hear. When you try to subvert the power of government, you're playing with a live wire. And that is why people split into two camps the second you say the words deep state. One camp hears the shadow government and rolls its eyes. He says, oh my God, here we go. Here's this nut, this lunatic. The other hears, in essence, shadow government and starts connecting every dot like it's a crime board. I don't know which camp I used to be in, but I decided to take the idea seriously, not as a cartoon, not as a single puppet master, but as a practical question. And that's the purpose of this. Who makes decisions when nobody is looking? Start with a very simple test. Is a power center democratic or unaccountable? If it's democratic, it can be audited, it can be challenged, voted out, corrected. If it's unaccountable, it can steer outcomes without even asking permission and without ever taking the blame. That's the real question, under the deep state label. Not lizard people, not magic, just accountability. That's what we're talking about. History doesn't rescue us here. No, history indicts us. Every era, every country, every system that called itself a republic or an empire, developed a second layer. Ancient Athens, for example, had voting and speeches, civic pride, and it also had the boule, B-O-U-L-E, a council that filtered what citizens even got to vote on. And historians describe it as dominated by elites. Rome had senates and laws and ceremony, and it also had the Praetorian Guard. This is the muscle close enough to become kingmakers. Empires and monarchies and courts had advisors, barons, financiers, and fixers who could shape policy quietly or remove a ruler when the mood struck. If you want a modern version, look at any place where corporate power and government power fuse so tightly that the elections become a speed bump. It's also called fascism. It's not exotic. That's human. So the deep state idea is not a modern American invention. It's a modern American argument. An argument about an ancient political problem. Who's really pulling the strings? And what happens when the public is the last one to know? You know, consider that, but then bring it forward to a modern democracy. You see a clean front end, elections, laws, courts, hearings, press conferences, polling. You see the surface. But the deep layers matter more because the deeper layers select the options, control the information, and set the default. If the public is offered two choices that were both pre-approved by the same networks when the vote is real, but the menu was rigged. You see, what's interesting right now is, that sounds kind of dramatic, and I understand this, until you look at the research people cite whenever they argue that the public doesn't drive policy. In 2014, for example, political scientists Martin Gylens and Benjamin Page analyzed about 1,800 policy issues and reported that the preferences of American citizens had no discernible independent effect on policy outcomes once elite and interest group preferences were accounted for. Think about that one. Now, that single finding, it doesn't prove a grand plot, but it does something even more unsettling. It suggests the system can look democratic while behaving like a managed machine. So what fills the gap between what people want and what government does? That's a great question, and the gravamen, so to speak, of our question. Networks and incentives, bureaucratic momentum, money, secrecy, the revolving door, media sourcing, in other words, the plumbing. How does this work? One way to understand the deep state without going off the rails is to imagine an iceberg. Now, the visible part, of course, is what civics class describes. The submerged part is what actually keeps the ship moving when the captain changes. Now, this was popularized years ago. And whatever you think about politics, the metaphor works because it captures continuity. See, elections change faces, and the machine keeps its bearing. And what's also interesting is the first obvious node, so to speak, is national security, meaning the military, intelligence, and the contractor web around them. Eisenhower warned in 1961 about the military-industrial complex, one of the greatest things he ever said, and he should know, and the danger of misplaced power. He wasn't describing a conspiracy. He was describing incentives. Big budgets, big programs, big careers, and big profits all aligned towards growth. Now, once that engine is built, it doesn't like to idle, so to speak. That's one reason forever wars keep finding new justifications, even when theoretically, even when the public is exhausted or they say they're exhausted. See, that's the problem. That's the issue. Even when they say they're exhausted. Now, it is one reason that threat narratives metastasize. It's one reason procurement becomes a culture. It's also why oversight is so hard. And the deeper the secrecy, the fewer the people allowed to see. And the easier it is for the briefers to become the drivers. You don't even need to claim anything sinister. You don't at all. See, information itself becomes power. If you are the person who says what the threat is, or how severe it is, and what options exist, you are not just advising the elected official, you are shaping their reality. And that's critical. The second node, if you will, is intelligence. Intelligence and surveillance. Modern intelligence systems are not just spies and trench coats. They are data, signals, platforms, and partnerships. And the scale of classification is itself a structural problem. When governments classify enormous volumes of material, accountability shifts from voters and legislators to clearance holders and gatekeepers of information. That's not automatically evil. It's automatically ripe for abuse. It's also automatically resistant to correction because the public cannot argue with facts it is not allowed to see. And the third node is the bureaucracy, the permanent civil service, the regulatory world, and what people now call the administrative state. Here is where deep state talk gets both more boring and more important. A huge modern government requires continuity. You can't swap out everything every 4 years and still run air traffic control and disaster response and food safety and tax collection and the rest. The old patronage spoils system was chaotic and corrupt, and reforms like merit hiring were meant to professionalize the state. But professionalism has a trade-off. Continuity creates autonomy. Autonomy creates drift. Drift creates a sense among voters that nothing changes no matter who wins. And that feeling is not always paranoia. You see, sometimes it's the predictable effect of a massive machine that moves slowly and defends its own process. This is also why the word deep state became more resonant in the last decade. Trust fell, Vietnam, Watergate, Iraq, WMD, claims, and the Snowden disclosures all taught the public a brutal lesson. The official story can be wrong. It can be manipulated or incomplete. In 2018, there was a poll that was found that while most Americans were not familiar with the term deep state, when it was described as unelected officials who secretly manipulate or direct national policy, about 74% said that they believed that exists. That was from Monmouth University. And that's not fringe, by the way. That's mass suspicion. Well, then came the Trump era, when deep state became a political weapon and also a political explanation. Sometimes it pointed at intelligence leaks. Sometimes it pointed at internal resistance. Often it pointed at bureaucracy itself. The label traveled because it fit a lived experience. Voters watch politicians promise one thing and then deliver another. They watched bank bailouts happen fast while ordinary pain lingered. They watched inequality widen. They watched people who never miss a meal tell them the system is working. So the deep state becomes a folk theory for a modern truth. Modern governance is not just elections, it's networks. And now the fourth layer, the fourth node, if you will, money. Money isn't just campaign donations. Money is lobbying and consulting and think tanks and board seats and legal strategies and relationships and past government paydays. It's also technical expertise. On economic policy, central bankers, bond markets, and financial giants can exert pressure because they understand the system better than most elected officials and because markets can punish policy instantly. That is not a smoke-filled room argument, that's leverage. And even Congress has documented how big defense contractors spend heavily to shape policy. By the way, let me throw in today big tech that makes the old MIC look like a joke. A Congressional Research Service product notes open secrets, reporting that the defense contractors spent over $100 million on lobbying in 2022. Again, that's not proof of a hidden coup, it's proof of influence. And it's also proof of proximity. The closer you get to power, the more you can bend outcomes. And proximity is the theme that ties us together. The deep state is not one thing, it's a completion and a competition to stand nearest the levers. And the fifth node, if you will, is the global footprint. A country with hundreds of overseas facilities, alliances, and deployments builds a permanent foreign policy machine that doesn't reboot easily. Even reporting about current basing describes a vast worldwide web. A worldwide web of sorts, maintained through agreements, not ownership, and it shapes what options seem realistic to decision makers. You see, when your default posture is global presence, the default politics become interventionist. Then the budget follows. Then the contractors follow, and the cycle becomes itself reinforcing. The sixth node is media and narrative. This is the hardest to talk about without sounding unhinged, so I'll keep it simple. Media are dependent on access. Access often comes from official sources. Official sources have incentives, and incentives shape what gets leaked, what gets framed, what gets emphasized, and what gets ignored. Sometimes reporters do heroic work. Sometimes they become stenographers. Sometimes they are fed a storyline and don't realize it until years later. The point is that not the media are puppets. The point is that the information ecosystems, my new favorite word, can be managed by those who control information. That's why the deep state lives partly in culture. It is not just what government does, it's what people assume is possible. So is the deep state real? Absolutely. If by the deep state you mean a single hidden committee running everything, no, that's too neat. The real world is messier, full of turf wars and ego and incompetence and conflicting agendas. If by deep state you mean a durable set of unaccountable systems that can steer policy regardless of elections, then yes, absolutely. Yep, it exists in degrees, in sectors, and through incentives. It is real enough to matter. Which brings us to the only question that matters. What do we do about it? You start with transparency. Contracts, meetings, records, exceptions should be justified, not automatic. When secrecy is necessary, oversight must be real. It must be staffed and adversarial, not ceremonial. Protect whistleblowers. A system that punishes insiders for revealing wrongdoing is a system that selects for silence, not integrity. Tighten the revolving door. Cooling off periods, disclosure requirements, and enforcement that actually bites. If you can regulate an industry today, then collect a fortune from it tomorrow, the public is not crazy to suspect capture. Reduce contractor dependence where it deploys or rather destroys accountability. And if the state outsources core functions, then the public loses visibility because private entities hide behind proprietary walls. That's how democracy gets hollowed out while still looking intact. And yes, address money in politics, to be sure. If 3/4 of the public want limits on and nothing happens, that's not a mystery, it's a signal. And none of this requires hysteria. It requires clarity. And the deep state is not a bedtime story. It's what happens when complexity and secrecy and incentives outgrow political control. You can laugh at the term. You can laugh all you want if you want, but don't laugh at the problem. The problem is older than any party. The problem is that power hates sunlight, and modern systems have built in endless shade. And the best way to take the deep state seriously is to stop treating it like a monster under the bed and start treating it like what it usually is, a network of human beings making deals, protecting turf, shaping narratives, and pursuing incentives inside a machine too big for the public to see. That is dangerous. Not because it's magical, but because it's normal. Okay? So, my friends, this is something we've talked about. Please understand this, commit this to memory, grasp the notion of this, and do everything in your power to understand the importance and the criticality and the necessity of understanding that what you were taught in school, what you believe to be true, isn't in any way, even remotely, the truth. Thank you so much for watching, my friends. Please comment. Please like the video. Hit that little bell so you're notified of live streams and new videos. Like this video. Liking is critical. And also, I've got some questions for you. Put them into your questions, into your areas, because I've thought them through, and your input is so critical to flesh everything out, to add a dimension to this agreement and this discussion that I think is so wonderful. And I thank you for that. Until we meet again, my friends, I say to you right now, this is your new best friend, Lionel, reminding you and asking you to comment as you see fit.